Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Lazarovich, and I'm chairing this webinar on behalf of the European Movement in Scotland. Welcome to everyone tonight. This is the latest webinar in the series we've now been running for a number of years, organised by the European Movement in Scotland. We are Scotland's largest pro-European organisation, with membership and supporters from across the political spectrum, and indeed people, of course, who are members, supporters of no particular party. And we work closely with our partner organisation, the European Movement UK. One of our areas of activity is to put under the spotlight the European policies of all the political parties. Last year, we held a series of very successful Q&A sessions with the spokespersons on European issues of the 5 Scottish political parties in the Scottish Parliament. Given recent political developments, we've just written to all the candidates for leadership of the SNP to ask them for their policies on Europe. And tonight, of course, our focus is on Labour. Now, the opinion polls, we all know, predict there will be a Labour government, possibly with a big majority after the next general election. Now, we all know that opinion polls can change. That goes without being said before everyone else says it. But it seems reasonable to project that there will be a change in government after the next election. So what the Labour Party plans to do in the field of European policy is, of course, therefore particularly important and particularly interesting. We're fortunate to have 3 speakers tonight with a wide range of experience on European issues and much more besides. As we only have a limited period, I hope you and they will excuse me if I only give an introduction to each of our speakers, which will only touch upon all of their knowledge and expertise. Our first speaker is Ian Murray, the Labour MP for Edinburgh South since 2010, a seat which he has held continuously since then. Prior to being an MP, he was an Edinburgh City Councillor. He has been Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for most of that time, and he was one of the most prominent supporters of the People's Vote campaign calling for final vote on the Brexit deal. Dianne Hayter, we're very pleased to welcome you tonight, has been a Labour member of the House of Lords since 2010. She's had many roles outside politics, but in the political arena, I would highlight her role as General Secretary of the Fabian Society, longest established Labour think tank between 76 and 82. From 1990 to 1996, Chief Executive of the European Parliamentary Labour Party, that is the group of Labour MPs. She's held several senior roles for Labour in the House of Lords, and she's just recently been the co-author of a book, The Forgotten Tribe, a biography or a collection of chapters on the Labour MEPs who served the European Parliament from the time they first appeared until 2019. And finally, we have Dennis McShane. Welcome, Dennis. Dennis was an MP from 1994 to 2012. During his time there, he held a number of ministerial roles, serving as Minister for Europe under Tony Blair from 2002 to 2005. He is rightly described as a prolific writer and commentator, having written more than 10 books on European politics, including 3 on Brexit, about which he writes and broadcasts regularly. I note that one of the books was titled Brexiternity, the Uncertain Fate of Britain, and argues that Brexit will dominate British politics, economics, and international relations for years to come, on which I will not comment. So there are 3 speakers. We'll start with Ian Murray. Ian, I should say, we'll have to leave at 6:30 p.m. this evening. So when it comes to the Q&A, if I seem to be giving more attention to Ian initially, it's to allow him to leave a bit earlier. We hope to have plenty of time in the hour or so we've got left now for Q&A. If you've got questions, would you please put the questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom screen, not in the chat, just in the Q&A. And if anyone has any problems with volume or hearing people clearly or anything like that, please tell us in the chat session. But otherwise, for Q&A, put your questions in the Q&A. I will then moderate your questions to the speakers. So, with no further ado, thanks again, Ian, for joining us tonight. Over to you, Ian Murray.
Well, Mark, thank you for that. And can I just start by thanking the European Movement in Scotland, not only for everything that they have done in the past, but continue to do in terms of this issue. And it's no doubt it's an issue that's not going to go away or not going to be resolved anytime soon. So the work that you're doing at the moment and the work that you have done is vital. And we've all been on the marches together during the height of the May administration when the People's Vote campaign came about, and I was one of the initial MP members of the People's Vote campaign, and very proud of what we nearly achieved. I think, you know, the numbers were creeping towards a majority in Parliament back in December 2019, and I was across the spreadsheet more than once a day in terms of trying to persuade colleagues to get that over the line. And I don't know if history will ever tell us if we would have got it over the line, but we're certainly very, very close indeed. And it's a shame that we ended up back at the polls rather than trying to force that through Parliament. But we are where we are, and it's important that we move forward to that. I suppose I should just start by saying the overall context of where we are in terms of the party's policy, which is what I'm really here to talk about. And it's not necessarily a comfortable policy for anybody involved in the European movement in Scotland, or indeed for the Labour Party, the vast majority of the Labour movement, to be involved in. But actually, it's just the reality of the situation that we've got. And the two things I would like to say, just to start off and giving it some kind of context, is that we've been through over the last 7 or 8 years now, longer potentially in the Scottish context, the most incredible political turmoil, all based on proposition and supposition that has proven to be incorrect. And what Keir Starmer wants to do as Prime Minister, and indeed he's doing that as leader of the opposition, is he refuses point blank to be dishonest with the public. He will not have his integrity questioned. He's spent his entire life as in the legal industry, but also Director of Public Prosecutions, demanding integrity in public life and prosecuting it when it wasn't happening. And he's very clear that he wants to be honest with the public, and we have to break politics out of this cycle of dishonesty with the public, and he's quite keen to do that. And the reason I say that is because it feeds into where our Brexit policy is at the moment. And the policy is that on day one of a Keir Starmer premiership, he will go into number 10, sit behind the desk, if there is actually a desk to sit behind, and he will have to deal with the circumstances that he has in front of him at that time. And the circumstances he will have will be a pretty dire set of circumstances, but a relationship with the European Union will be one. And it's quite clear that on day one, we're going to have to, as a government, make sure that that trade and cooperation agreement can work. And make it work, because until we can do that, there is no other scope beyond that to try and find a way of rebuilding a relationship with the European Union and then deepening that relationship. And we said all the way at the very start, back in, I think it was December the 19th, 2019, when the division bell rang on this trade and cooperation agreement, that it was thin. It was a dreadful agreement. It wasn't oven ready at all. It wouldn't do what it said on the tin, but we've seen this as being the floor of our future relationship with the European Union, whereas this current government sees it as A, the ceiling, and B, as a battering ram to continue to tarnish our reputation both at home and in Europe, and indeed in the wider international community. So the first stop in this journey on day one of a new Labour government is to make this trade and cooperation agreement work. You can see some of that happening already, actually, because the Northern Ireland Protocol, whilst not perfect, is a step in the direction of trying to make a pretty poor deal work. And there's a whole host of areas that I'm sure will come up in questions tonight, from trade, from the movement of people, from individual sectors, from us moving around in Europe. All of those kinds of big issues are all part of making that trade and cooperation agreement work much better. Once you've then made it work, you then open up the door for rebuilding our relationships with our closest partners. And I spend a lot of time with our ambassadorial network in the EU member states and non-EU member states. I did a big event with them, with all of their directors of political here in the UK, organised by the EU mission here in London just before Christmas. And the message to them was clear: until the UK can repair its reputation and can be trusted once more, there's nothing really on the table beyond trying to deepen that relationship based on the basis of the trade and cooperation agreement that's there. So it's the reality of the situation that we are in. And Keir wants to be pretty clear that he will talk in reality and not try and wish a set of circumstances upon the country that are not there. The second stage of that, of course, once you're able to make this cooperation agreement work, is then to deepen it and to strengthen it in a number of areas, in security cooperation, in the way in which we interact with each other individually, in the way in which we have frictionless trade with goods and services, and improving some of the sectorial deals that would have to be done, whether that be in pharmaceuticals and chemicals, in financial services, all of these big issues that are still essentially outstanding from what we've got at the moment, all under the umbrella, of course, of trying to make sure that we're not damaging our economy as much as we've already damaged it through this process. And once you're able to then do that, the relationship then grows and develops beyond that. And then the third part of that, once we've repaired a relationship, deepened that relationship and made the current deal work as best we can, is to do what's in the best interests of the country and in the best interests of our European partners. And I think that's really the only game in town. Now, I know there's a drive, and it's an understandable drive, for us to have a policy of rejoining the European Union. I just don't think that's a sensible place to be. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's credible, and I'm not really sure it's honest with the public either that that's going to be achievable by the next Labour government. I know the single market and customs union is part of that debate, but again, the same rules apply. I'm just not sure that's going to be on the table. I'm not sure it's worth the kind of political capital you would have to put behind that, even to get it on the table with our European Union partners, let alone win an election on the back of it, is pretty difficult. And really, it's just an honest policy that we've got that I think is the only way forward. People might say, well, you know, this isn't the best place for the country to be. It's not the best place for the Labour Party to be. The constituency that I sit in at the moment and represent was 76% Remain. Of course, Scotland was 62% Remain. The Make Brexit Work policy was developed by us all, of which I was a key part of, because I realised that continuing down the route of trying to re-establish ourselves as a member of the European Union was not going to be on the table, and therefore we had to be realistic about what could be achieved and what we should be trying to achieve in the first few stages of where we are. So the current government have messed it up. They'll continue to mess it up because they're not doing this in the national interest, they're doing it in their party interest, which is what they do with everything. You can see that with some of the policies that they've got. The Northern Ireland Protocol is not Rishi Sunak trying to resolve some of the problems we've got in the European Union. It's President Biden saying to the UK, unless you resolve some of these big issues by the time we get to the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in April, and I'm sure Dennis will mention this, the President of the United States and America and some of our closest allies would be very, very unhappy indeed. And that's what's driven that process. But the future Labour government will be driving our process to do what's in the national interest, and what is in our national interest is a much closer and much more fruitful and much more mutually beneficial relationship with the European Union across all the big issues that we currently discuss. And until we get there and prove that we can do that, it's going to be much more difficult to talk about it in the abstract, but I can assure you that's our commitment. And we have to desperately get Britain's tattered relationship with our closest allies and partners, but also the international community back before we can even achieve some of that. So I hope that gives a little bit of a canter through, Mark, of at least the start of the debate tonight in the webinar and where our policy currently stands. And I look forward to hearing from Dianne and Dennis in terms of what their contributions got to be.
Thanks so much, Ian. And can I remind those who are who joined us tonight, if you have any questions, you want to have a debate and discussion, please put your questions into the Q&A box. We had one so far. Like a few more, we'll try and moderate them in a way to try and get an effective discussion. So any more questions, I'm sure there'll be plenty, please put them in the Q&A box. But before I go to questions, I will now go to Dianne Hayter and ask Dianne to give her perspective on the question today.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to join a very esteemed group, both of speakers and, by the sounds of it, the people watching as well. I mean, I start just to explain one of the things, because I know I'm still seen by some as one of the problems, is that first of all, I'm Welsh. And we didn't vote anything like the Scots in the referendum. And one's response, therefore, I think, to the results of the referendum were different. I was never in favour of people's vote. It's the only thing I think I could ever disagree with Ian, who I admire enormously on. But I was always thought it was a great mistake that we concentrated on that rather than try and get a better deal and stay in the customs union. And it seems to me that we sort of possibly missed a trick. Had we really tried to do that, we might have had a better relationship. And I think that's really important, because in that sense, I'm now, locked up with Ian about where we go forward, is trying not obviously to join the customs union, because that wouldn't be what we're in favour of, but joining a trading relationship whereby the way we facilitate trade and our tariffs and our everything else is much closer, and you find another way of doing it. And I think that that is going to be really important, both in day-to-day work with our partners, but also because the TCA is up for review in 2025, which means the work for the sake of labour will have to be next year. And therefore, I think we need an agenda built over the next, well, really before we get into government, because as Dennis, I was never in government, Dennis will tell us, and Ian, I hope, is about to find out, when you're in government, you'll have very, very little bandwidth to do any serious thinking. It is day to day, it's relentless. And so I'm hoping that we can do some serious about what exactly we would want the review of the TCA to be there. Some of us are already involved in that. I sit on something called the PPA, the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, which is a body between the UK Parliament and the European Parliament, where we're just beginning to work out how to work together, but to get the two parliaments thinking and preparing both the language, if you like, the scope, maybe a better way of describing it, of how we should move forward. And I think that we need to beginning to put some serious heft into that. I'd say just a couple of other things. One is, yes, we must build a new relationship with the EU, but I also think we have to build a relationship with the rest of Europe, the continent, and how we respond to the other close but non-EU members in the continent is also important. I'm not saying we rejoin EFTA, I'm not saying anything like that, but there is a group of really important member state or non-member states, but European states who also trade with the EU and relate with it in all sorts of different ways, some in the single market, some not, but some outside of that tighter circle, where I think we need, and we're not really doing it at the moment, we haven't got a way of dealing with that. There is no machinery for that, but actually together we might be able to build up an even better relationship with the EU. Some of our issues, like over rules of origin and all of that, will be very common, and those are ones we need to discuss. I think the other issue I would just say is that not just, as Ian says, it's no point talking about at the moment about rejoining, but what we do have to give is to business some confidence that we're not going to spend all our time on debating and re-engineering a constitutional arrangement when what they want is certainty. They want to know what our laws are going to be. They want to know the priority we're going to give to the EU as opposed to the CPTPP or to relationship with the US and all of that. And I think the business needs some, or will do, nearer we get to the election, some real confidence that we've got a clear agenda of how we want business, because that's what most of our trade is, our service sector as well as our goods sector is going to work with the EU. And therefore we need to, as we are doing, I think, as a party, talk a lot to the big players who are, as I say, not just in the EU, but in the wider family of the European Union, looking to see about our investments, about, yes, mobility of labour, which will be really important, particularly in the service sector. And I don't mean free movement in the old way, but the movement of people to be able to work across those different economies. So I think there's an enormous amount still for the Labour Party to do, which has to be done taking the confidence of our electorate, which not being standing for and never having stood for Parliament. I leave that to Ian and the others to worry about that side of it, but carrying the confidence of industry that needs to work closely with us as we go forward, I think will be really important. I hope that gives you a flavour of what I hope we might be able to work on over in the period before we get into government.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Dianne. I don't know if it was apparent on the screen, but I had a temporary technical difficulty. So my apologies if anyone didn't see me for a while. I know there's a couple of questions come in, but I would like to go straight into Dennis Conshane at this stage and hear what you have to say. Thank you for joining us tonight. Dennis.
Mark, thanks a lot, Dianne, your ladyship, your baroness-ship. Merci beaucoup, Ian. Always great. I mean, you kept that flag flying, and it's flying higher and higher, because my assessment at the moment is that the first Brexit era chapters, if you like, are now over. The 7 years since Brexit, you had the long build up to Brexit, which actually started way back in the 1990s. I just was looking at my diaries I kept every day as an MP and minister, and I find, Mark, you'll like this, that in 1997, Bill Cash is threatening to sue me because I said he wanted to leave the European Union. He said this was an outrageous defamation, absolutely scandalous, and his lawyers would be on like a ton of bricks. Well, I did point out to the dear old buffer that I'd actually said it in the House of Commons, and while I'm quite sure Suella Braverman was very happy soon to remove the privileges of the House of Commons to build her better Britain, there wasn't much he could do about it. But of course he was lying. And we went through just a gradual build up year after year after year. Dianne was certainly holding the fort in the European Parliament, and we ended up with Brexit in 2016. Since then, we've had Brexit revealing itself to be really a complete flop. It's eating itself alive. I sometimes compare it to a Moloch, one of those great beasts from the ancient Greek or ancient Persian deeps, eating everybody alive. It's eaten Cameron, it's eaten Theresa May, it's eaten Boris Johnson, it's eaten Liz Truss, it's eaten up a lot of the Labour Party, because we also went way off piste for 6-7 years. And we can absolutely sense with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and also I'd say it's eaten up the Scottish Nationalist Party. The fact that Nicola Sturgeon, I know we're not talking about Scotland especially, and I'm very nervous, of course, despite being Lanarkshire born and ever saying the word Scotland through my mouth, but nonetheless, Nicola Sturgeon was also, like Boris Johnson, selling a pup, namely that Scotland could secure an independence based on rejoining the European Union. Everybody knew it would make a completely hard border between England and Scotland, and I think she just gave up the ghost because she realised she hadn't been telling the full truth to the Scottish people in recent years. And now we're seeing with this rather weird three-way election, again, where Europe certainly has not been discussed, so far as I can see, as much as I track it, that the SNP is eating a lot of itself alive. So this should offer new possibilities for Labour. I'm talking about the politics here. Business, well, yes, you run an Italian oil rig in the North Sea, it's going wrong. You want to send a technician, a qualified petroleum oil rig engineer out from Iran that night. You can't do it because the English rules won't allow you to come in unless he has a work permit, He's got regulatory clearance. All his kit is being checked, and so the man or the woman doesn't come. And frankly, the reason for that is because that can only happen under conditions of free movement. And so when we say we want to build a new relationship, do you want to do it with Airbus that sends thousands of specialized engineers from Toulouse all over the Airbus factories in the continent of Europe, but can't do that at the moment into the UK? That is how difficult those decisions are going to be for all of us. Now, Labour, just historically, briefly, Mark, let's be very clear, let's be honest, this is a Labour Party discussion with three great Labour people in front of me. We were, until the late 1980s, the anti-European party. We said no to the coal and steel community in 1950. Dennis Healey wrote all the theoretical reasons why proud global Britain could not join with its European partners. I mean, Ernie Bevan and Clement Attlee just didn't quite understand it, but they followed the Healey line. Then Yates came up and said, joining the European Economic Community means giving up 1,000 years of history. And then we moved forward into the 1970s with Tony Benn, and then later in the 1970s, early 80s, Robin Cook, my friend, Jack Straw, Neil Kinnock, all our great heroes, but they were constantly sending out a hostile message to Europe, even to having the point of having an election in 1983, where we actually had on the paper Tony Blair, you can look at his posters, said, vote Blair and we'll leave this the European community. Good, turned round quite a bit in the 1990s, but I remember saying to Tony once, coming back from Madrid or Warsaw or wherever, terrific speech on Europe, Tony, passionate, really good points, well made, I know, because I used to write them. Is there any chance you could make a pro-European speech in England, in Britain? And he said, oh, Dennis, what can I do with the effing tabloids I've got? Well, that certainly was a fair point. The point about big politics is you don't allow the effing tabloids to always set your agenda. And I completely agree with Ian that talking about rejoin is frankly daft. I keep patrolling European capitals, and everywhere I say to them, look, couldn't we have a mini rejoin? You know, just let the young people go, or the artists, or some professionals. And they just look at me in the Treasury, the Trésor in Paris, the Quai d'Orsay, and the Bellevue in Brussels, and they say, Dennis, you left. Get over it. We're not going to get a partial rejoin. And while I sort of agree with Dianne, the second referendum campaign was a mistake. I wrote an article in The Guardian at the time saying that, so I'm not being wise after the event. The plain fact is, Dianne, we had no choice because Theresa May had gone full UKIP very quickly after the Brexit vote. If you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Brexit means Brexit. Frankly, I had no other way out. And we had Jeremy Corbyn, who was completely lost because he'd voted in every vote on Europe in the House of Commons against European partnership. I was with him on Alice Marr's funeral on Monday in Halifax. And, you know, I mean, I like Jeremy. He's a moralist. He's a preacher. He's a home to lost causes. He's not really a politician, but Labour was stuck with him and the team around him for 5 very destructive years. So where are we now? How do we exploit the fact that you'll not get a single Conservative MP or right-wing columnist ready to say Brexit is working? It isn't. You've got more and more businessmen, bosses, individual CEOs, bosses of the British Chambers of Commerce, which is very good, a little CBI up to a point, saying Brexit isn't working. I'm worried Labour will be the only voice in the room that says Brexit must be made to work. I completely agree, and I go on all the right-wing media, the LBCs, the GB News saying, of course, we can't talk about rejoin. We had the referendum vote. We had then 2 elections that confirmed, as it were, the referendum vote, and that Labour didn't win and the pro-Brexit party, the Tories, did. And it is actually arrogant nonsense to say we can rejoin instantly. Plus, you'll have can't find anybody on the continent that wants to open the door to that. So, but surely we can actually criticize Brexit without saying we're going to rejoin, shred what is being proposed at the moment. And I think we've got to create that culture. I'm a bit worried, a little bit worried. I feel good. I'm out canvassing regularly where I live in London for ex-Labour candidates. I'm a bit worried that if we spend the next 2 years telling everybody that our line is more or less the same as the Conservatives, it isn't. I know there are nuances. But it sounds the same. No single market, no customs union. Then there might be a drift to other parties, the Greens, maybe the Lib Dems will finally rediscover their what they believed in. The Scottish Nationalists, under whoever is the election winner, will be the party of Europe. They'll profile themselves as that. We may actually not get the big thumping majority that certainly the polls at the moment indicate. In 1997, the Tories had 67 seats more than us. Today they have 166. This is not climbing Mont Blanc Everest. This is climbing 200 Munros under a lot of pressure. So I just worry a little bit about that. So we have to think and discuss. I'm very pleased to be on the executive of the Labour Movement for Europe with Stella Creasy as its excellent chair. They're doing great work. It's the fastest growing membership organisation within the Labour Party. A lot of the candidates that we've nominated, because it is an affiliated part of the Labour Party, so the Labour Movement for Europe can nominate candidates and so on, like the Fabians and others, are being selected as parliamentary candidates. So we're getting back into a parliamentary Labour Party that I think will be much more open on Europe. And the question is how we shape the debate in the next 2 years. As I say, I do keep insisting, don't talk about rejoin. But frankly, if you want more, I heard David Lammy do a marvellous speech at Chatham House. He said, we will sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol. But it looks as if the new Minister for Europe, I don't know if you've heard about him, Mark or Ian or Dianne. He's a chap called King Charles III. He is now, our Minister for Europe. He's going to France to do a state visit. He hosted a meeting he met with Ursula von der Leyen at the start of last week. And Buckingham Palace press statement said, King Charles, on the advice of the government, quite rightly, is meeting with Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, and a world leader. A world leader?
Dennis,
I mean, for God's sake, Baroness called the last president of the European Council a dish rag, a tow rag, like a sort of second-rate broken down bank clerk. And the papers about Juncker, and Dianne, like me as a veteran of this, and Mark, just treated the president of the commission as an absolutely unspeakable non-entity. Now the king says he's a world leader. So this is changing. He's going then to the Bundestag, first British monarch to address the German parliament, straight from France. We have got Charles, he's 75 this year. He's not a young guy, probably, nearly as old as Mark and I are. He is going full scale to reconnect with Europe. He's doing it all by himself. And he's doing it obviously with a slight nod from Sunak. And I worry, Ian, that Sunak I don't think he's stupid, but I think he might walk round us on Europe if we're not clever. And we'll still be saying, no rejoin, no customs unions, no nothing. And he'll be doing a Northern Ireland Protocol, a little deal here, a little deal there. So we just need to keep a weather eye out on that, Ian, because that's what business wants to hear. Okay. I'll stop at that point.
Yes. Thank you. Right. And we didn't have many questions in the Q&A box for a start. We've had quite a lot now, and we've had even more questions from Dennis for the last period. So I want to go straight over to Ian. Ian, I was going to moderate all the questions, but there's so many come in comments. Can I perhaps let you respond as and as you wish and how you can to sort of come in and then maybe respond to others. So, Ian.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark, and it's great to get the context of all of this, and thanks for the questions that are coming in. Look, they're probably around 3 different topics, so let me try and see if I can take some of them. Particularly, I wanted to look at the one that Sue Scarrett put in about the Labour Party's current position and asking about what is the opinion of maintaining regulatory alignment. Well, actually, that's part of the process here. So what we would do, and Keir and Rachel Reeves have been very clear on this, is that individual sectors where regulatory alignment is close and should stay close is something that we'd want to build on in terms of improving our trading relationship with the EU. So there's a whole list of sectors, whether that be pharmaceuticals, finance, medical, biomedical. There's a whole host of ones where we would be maintaining and improving on regulatory alignment, because that is the closer trading relationship that Keir's talked about. In fact, if you remember, I don't think you may not remember, but he spoke at the National Farmers Union in Birmingham 2 weeks ago, and this was exactly the question that he gave to the agricultural sector, was that he would look to try and get a better deal for Britain's farmers and Britain's agricultural sector, and of course that means regulatory alignment. So that's exactly what the sort of Labour vision is in terms of taking this forward. And John, just above you on the Q&A, says something quite similar. Would we aspire to re-engage with the EU? Well, that's what this is all about. It is about re-engaging with the EU, and re-engagement's the first step actually in trying to make any of this work, and then trying to build upon it. So we can't do any of this in isolation. And as Dennis has laid out in what he says, it takes 2 to tango. And our European Union partners need to be assured of 3 things. 1, that the government are doing this for all the right reasons. 2, we can be trusted and be trusted partners. And 3, we don't going to tarnish our own relationship by breaking not only EU law but international law with everything that we do. And all of that goes back to what Dennis said, that the European Union issue has eaten many more prime ministers than any other issue. And in actual fact, if we don't re-engage with the EU and we don't re-engage with the issue, then we won't be able to deal with any of the issues that we want to do. So, John says in his question, do we aspire to re-engage with the EU? And that's what this policy is all about. It is about the aspiration of re-engaging, because that's what we seek to do. Joe and Vivian and others have talked about Scottish independence. Look, there's a great irony here, isn't there? And I can understand people's aspirations to be back and as an EU member state. And Brexit is a disaster and will continue to be so under its current trajectory, and the government is making it a disaster. And I don't think you resolve that disaster by doing something equally as disastrous. And 2 wrongs don't make a right in this particular issue. And I do want to say directly to Joe and to Vivian, who've asked that question, when I said at the very start, Keir doesn't want to be disingenuous with people, he absolutely means that. And the whole issue of let's break away from the United Kingdom to rejoin the European Union is a completely and utterly disingenuous argument with the proposition that's being put forward. And let's be quite clear about what the EU is. It's a legal construct of which we've left. And that legal construct, if you wish to be in a session state, is pretty clear. There is chapters of the treaties you have to satisfy, and the current proposition that's being put forward by the people who wish to break out of the UK is incompatible with those treaties. And people need to start being honest. And if the proposition for independence was, we will take euro, we will align, and we will become a full EU member state, and the border with England, incidentally, will be the trade and cooperation agreement. If those were the honest answers that we were given, then that would be the proposition in front of the public, Joe and Vivian. It would be that you would leave the UK and join the EU. But at this moment in time, the proposition is to leave the UK and maybe join the EU in a sort of Farage-esque style, that you take the good bits and you cherry pick the good bits and you disregard the bits that you don't think would be palatable to the public. And I just don't see that as being I find the whole argument around that disingenuous and not very simple to be able to deal with. And then just want to mention very quickly, if I may, Mark, I know I've spoken for probably longer than I wanted to, but Julius asks about things like Erasmus. That's the whole point of my opening remarks. Erasmus is one of the great examples, although in the scheme of things quite small, but one of the great examples of how you could actually have a greater relationship with the EU and rejoin Erasmus without being an EU member state. And the commission that we published back in December to rewire the whole of the United Kingdom has in there a proposal that devolved administrations, whether you be Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, or Greater Manchester, as an example, would have the power to rejoin international organisations in areas that are devolved. So if Scotland, Wales has actually almost rejoined Erasmus. Scotland was promised by the Scottish Government that it would and has dropped that particular policy. But you would be then allowed to rejoin Erasmus if you so wish to. And I do think there's a big case to do that. I spent a lot of time with the International Department at the University of Edinburgh. And these are some of the big issues about re-engaging with the EU and improving on the relationship that we would have to deal with. I think that's all in terms of, Keith McDonald asked about having an honest policy. That is, I'm trying to be honest, and Keir's trying to be honest about the realities of the situation that we're in. But in answer to all of those, it's quite clear that we can look at that priority in terms of 2025 that Carol's just talked about, and use that 2025 as the launch pad a year after, hopefully, the next Labour government, a year into having to prove that we can be trusted. We can use that 2025 renegotiation launch pad to do the things that we want to do to deepen and strengthen that relationship.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for covering quite a few of the points in the questions there. I want to go to one question which you've partly referred to already, Ian, but perhaps ask Dianne and then Dennis, and then come back to you, Ian, if you want to say anything else, which is the question again down from Carol. Does Labour have specific priorities that it wishes to pursue for the TCA, the Trading Cooperation Agreement, in 2025? So, well, I suppose for Ian it would be, does Labour have, and for Dianne and Dennis, what should Labour have? So I'll maybe go to Dianne and Dennis to do that point, and then back to you, Ian, if you want to deal with that briefly. But that's to give someone else a chance to come. Dianne, what's your views on that?
Can I just say that, you know, a bit of this is that we just should stop using the word Brexit. It is, you know, we have left, and the issue now is the future. And I think for all sorts of reasons beyond this issue, if Labour doesn't look like it's talking about the future and using words about the future, then we will not sound like we have a vision that we want to offer the electorate. So whatever we come up with, I think we just need to stop using that word. And even saying Brexit is working, I think is harmful. I'm sorry, Dennis, I think you invented the word Brexit, didn't you? If I remember correctly, a long time ago. Not that I'm unforgiving or anything, but they were. But, you know, so what we need to talk about is the future. And I feel this very strongly. I was born in Germany. You know, I helped set up the European TUC. I worked for the EPLP. You know, I feel a European enormously strongly. And therefore, I think Jim said, I'm not quite sure how you can criticize Brexit and not advocate rejoin. Well, it's because we left one union, the European Union. And A, that has changed even since we left, but B, we would not be rejoining the same thing. We would have to join the euro. There wouldn't be the UK rebate. We'd probably have to join Schengen. And then what Ian's just said, real proof of commitment that they're not ready for us yet. Dennis used the word that he was told no partial rejoin. When I met our socialist colleagues last week or whenever in the European Parliament, they accused us already of cherry picking, that our priorities for what we wanted to go back in were cherry picking. In other words, we wanted all the good bits, but we didn't really want to pay all that money, which would be much greater because we'd lost the rebate. So as we look to whatever relationship we have in the future, it won't be the same as what it was, because it will be, by the time it happened, 10 years on. And we, you know, my view is that we should stop a language that for a lot of young people is now behind us. It's just awful that we're not in the European Union, but we don't have to use the word Brexit. And I think that the issue of regulatory alignment is absolutely key. It is in the issues that have been mentioned. They're incredibly important for trade and all of that, and also for consumers. I come from a consumer background, but that's why we should be talking about trade. And a bit of me would like to put our relationship with the EU under Nick Thomas-Symonds, in the sense of a large part of this is our trading relationship, and it ought to be seen with the whole of the UK's trading relationship. You know, how we trade with the EU itself, how we trade, as I said, with the wider bit of the continent and the others. And we need to, and one of the things, because I chair our International Agreements Committee, is trying to look about whether any of the deals that we're now signing, whether that's with Australia, New Zealand, or CPTPP or anything else that happened, to check that they don't put barriers in front of that ever closer union that we want to have with the European Union. And we can't use the words they used to use, an ever closer union, but we can talk about ever closer relations. And we need to, it seems to me, to use that sort of language about building good trading and other relations. And then, as has just been said, if you're going to trade, you need the people to move around to be able to do it. But you're doing that because that's good for our economy, and not because we're harking back to how we had it. So some of this is PR. But I think the most important thing is to be future looking. So if I was to be looking about what the TCA would be renegotiating, it would be to make our trading relations easier, particularly in the service sector. I think that's really important, but also over the rules of origin and issues like that, and undoubtedly movement of workers business to business. But there will be others over trade facilitation that I think we could do a lot about. It all sounds very boring. It's not very sexy. Those of you who are standing for Parliament, this won't be what you've got on the doorstep, but behind the scenes, that's what we ought to be doing. Sorry, that was probably longer than you wanted, Mark. Apologies.
Well, that's helpful. Dianne, Dennis, do you want to, particularly on the TCA?
Just to add, yes, I was one of the first to use the word Brexit in 2012 because I was writing a lot about Grexit, and I wrote a column saying, supposing instead of Grexit, it might be Brexit that happens first. I mean, God, talk about a prophecy I wish I'd never made. Today, I worry slightly. People just don't really understand that the EU basically is a single market. I had removed from the proposed EU constitutional treaty the words ever closer union. It was just a gift I gave to the lunatics of the Daily Mail. It was in the preamble. It never had any legal force. But did I get any thanks for it? No. I mean, the French and the Dutch voted it down. That should have been a warning to us that all the referendums in Europe this century, bar one in Spain, on with Europe on the ballot paper, have resulted in a rejection. And that was the insanity of David Cameron. But never mind, we're well past. I do agree with Dianne. We have to indeed to move on. But when, for example, Julia says, let's rejoin Erasmus, the EU proposed that in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. They said, we want to keep youth exchanges going. And the British government said, no, because of course it has to be reciprocated. It's part of free movement. And when you say our people should move from London to the service sector, fly all over Europe, that can only happen with freedom of movement. You can't just, again, I don't want to use the word cherry picking, it's a bit patronizing, but it really can't happen unless we offer full reciprocity. Or currently you could do it, but it costs a lot of money. It's cheaper to set yourself up if you're a professor working in Athens at the British School, the great centre of Hellenic research, as a limited company than trying to negotiate, a week's worth of lecturing. This is what people don't quite understand it. I mean, I do worry slightly that we don't have, not so much on the shadow cabinet, more broadly, the higher reaches of the Labour Party in Parliament, anybody who's worked in Europe, who speaks European languages and who actually understands fully how Europe works. That's a difficulty. Certainly if we get close to government, I hope that Lotto, the leader's office, will be able to tap into real expertise, not just wishful thinking. And I'll tell you something that worries me, and thinking of you, I want you to be a very successful Scottish secretary. When we're right now, all the businesses are criticizing Brexit privately non-stop. Sorry, Dianne, there's no other word to use it. All right, isolation from Europe or the rupture with Europe, choose the one you like. But they're not attacking the government. Why? Because, of course, the business are friends of the Tory party on the whole, and they also need the grants and planning permissions and so on they get from government. If they criticize government, that doesn't come their way. When we're in power, that benign relationship won't be there. As Brexit becomes nastier and nastier, we're shrinking in economic size. We're not getting FDI. Our firms are now having to go to New York to be listed. Lloyd's has had to open an office with 300 people paying taxes to the Belgian taxpayer because nobody from Lloyd's can travel to Europe. You know, that morning I've got a problem. I'm jumping on the Eurostar. I'm jumping on a plane. It just can't. They can't come in and work like that. So we will have to find some answers, because I think when business, wait for the first business who says Labour's Brexit policy is a disaster. So Keir's refusal to allow us to hire the workers we need, to send our people where they need to make money, that Labour vision of Brexit is a disaster. You may say, oh, it's not our vision, that's the horrid Boris Johnson one. After 2024, 2025, it'll be Labour's Brexit. And if it's not working, and I'm sorry, I don't think it easily can be made to work, then it might actually turn into a negative from us. And then there'll be a smart Tory, just like Sunak sort of found a solution to the Northern Ireland Protocol, who turns it on its head and says, we're the party of business. We're going to open a real relationship with Europe, and Labour is stuck in the past. I just put that as a provocation to you, but it worries me.
Okay, thanks, Dennis.
Well, I'll say just one thing about that. I mean, under the Australia and New Zealand agreement, we've got essentially movement for business. You know, that could be one of the big asks in the renewal of the TCA.
Well, when we renew the TCA, you may be right, Dan, but for heaven's sake, I mean, I love Australia, but I don't go there because it takes about sort of 2 months to get there. I mean, as of today, up to when we left, everybody in every corner of our country could just go to Brexit and go to Europe anywhere and start doing business. They can't now because we won't accept reciprocity and full freedom of movement. We can try and get it for this sector or that sector. I mean, we should try that. But believe me, I don't think you'll find a lot of willing help on the other side. I regret that. I'd rather have partial step-by-step re-engagement, as I'm sure you would. And let's see what happens. But we need some people without calling for rejoin, without in any way being critical of the leadership. It's a very difficult time for Sir Keir, I know. Somebody who's got a license to just be a bit more forward-looking, a bit more interesting on this.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. I know Ian's got to go shortly, but so I want to go back to Ian. And first of all, there's a question in the Q&A about asking, under Gordon Brown's proposals for greater devolution, could Scotland have its own immigration arrangements under a Labour government at Westminster? So I'd invite Ian to answer that question, but also, as you will have to leave fairly shortly, and I see there's been a lot of discussion going on in the chat and the Q&A boxes, even without coming to the overall the screen here. If you want to say anything else in response to the various points that you picked up in the Q&A and chat.
Yeah, I've been trying to spin the plates, answer the webinar chat, do the Q&A, and listen to what other people have been saying as well. So apologies if I've missed things on that basis. But on the basis of different immigration systems, the Gordon Brown Commission report is pretty clear on that Scotland would have a much clearer say in what is required in terms of its own economic future, in terms of needs of the sector. So it's quite clear that there are unique sectorial challenges in terms of workforce in Scotland that are not necessarily duplicated across the whole of the UK. And that has to have a much greater input into what we require. So, sectorial visas and those kinds of issues are all part of that. And if you look at our rural hospitality businesses, for example, our whisky industry, which tends to be located in very rural areas in the parts of Scotland that have the most difficulty with retention and recruitment, those are the kinds of issues that would be part of that too. So it wouldn't, there is no proposal at this stage, although things may develop, but at this stage as we speak here tonight, there's no proposal to have separate immigration systems, but the proposals would be to have separate input into different responses to the sectorial needs, geographical sectorial needs right across the country, whether that be Scotland or Wales or rural Yorkshire or anywhere else, to try and deal with some of those particular industries and sectors that have specific geographical problems with retention and recruitment of workforce from overseas. And then maybe just as a sort of summing up, Mark, I'm really sorry I do have to, I could only give an hour this evening due to other constituency commitments, but I do think that we need a much more positive, it goes back to sort of what Dianne and Dennis have just said, I think we just need a much more positive dialogue about these kinds of issues. I mean, we're all still hurting that Brexit happened at all. I mean, can we believe it was 8 years ago now, and we're still really talking about the very infancy of what our relationship post that vote is about. And I think we really need a much more positive way of looking towards what our future relationship would look like. And that's essentially what our policy is trying to determine to do. But it is all based on just trying to be completely honest. And if there's not a magic wand out there to wish away what's happened in the past and the current circumstances that we are in. And Dennis is right, it is a huge risk for the party, but we're not doing this on the basis of what Rishi Sunak would do, which is do a few focus groups and then determine a policy on the basis of what might get you a few more votes. We're doing this in what is actually going to be practical and deliverable. And the only way we can really do that is to re-establish our relationships and re-engage with our EU member state friends and colleagues that we've worked with so clearly in the past. And Keir's made that commitment already. He spent a lot of time with Scholz in Germany. He was in Davos making the case with colleagues right across Europe, and that's gone down incredibly well. And that's that's what you have to do. That's what the Prime Minister is going to have to do. And we have got really conditioned in this country since 2015, since the EU referendum happened, to a complete distrust of their leaders in terms of what they say, what they can deliver and what they can do. And I just think if we were to do this webinar again on the 9th of March, 2029, just before the next general election after the first term of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, it'll be a much more positive conversation and we'll be in a much, much better place.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And we'll all look forward to see what happens over the next 5 and more, next 6 years. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate you have to go. Now, I appreciate we still have some time, but many of the questions and many of the chat are ones which are probably more directed at Ian to answer, though I'm sure both Dianne and Dennis could give their views on all of these as well. But I'm just going to try and pick out some ones which are perhaps more general, which haven't yet been covered in questions, or ones which are really more directed at Ian. Well, one question about could an independent Scotland, I suppose was applied to the UK as well, join EFTA more easily than joining the EU, and then Scotland join the EU later, having joined EFTA if Scotland was independent. Dianne or Dennis, do you want to say anything on that?
Well,
when we discussed it after the vote.
Dianne, you go, sorry.
Well, no, when we discussed it, quite soon after the referendum, the problem was that we would be so enormous within EFTA. we'd probably be 80% of the population, I think, of the EFTA countries, something enormous that there was at that time, a feeling that they may not want us. It would be a very difficult relationship, which is why early on I was suggesting maybe a looser, but countries and those other European countries that wouldn't put us in back into the relationship that EFTA has as part of the EEA. But again, because that again would be very difficult, or it would be at that time very difficult to us to talk about, because some of those have, well, all of them but Switzerland, I think, has free movement. And at that point, it was something that wasn't going to happen. So I'm more interested, if you like, about not exactly a circle, but a trading relationship with all the close neighbours of the EU, which would also then give us a relatively stronger negotiating stance than we have at the moment. You know, if we negotiate now a re-entry with the EU, you know, there's 500 million of them. There's only 60 million of us. We may not be able to negotiate a very good deal. We should also remember that as well. Somebody said, by the way, that what I said was a bit transactional. Well, actually, transactional, yeah, the whole point of us being in the European Union was that it was good for us. It was good for the UK. It was good for our young people. It was good for our industry. It was good for our economy. And that surely has to be the basis of our future relationship, is that it's good for us. And I think Marion Roberts says we should be talking about peace and equality and freedom of, I think, of movement. I'm not very good. I'm the same age as Prince Charles, so I find it very hard to look at all these things at the same time. King Charles. But actually, what the electorate wants and what our country needs is a relationship that does give us peace and security. A lot of that depends on America. We need one that gives us a lot of trade and an economy growing, and that depends on our relationship with the EU as our basic nearest market, and then further. So I don't think these things are alternative. I don't think talking about a trade agreement means you're not only also interested in our own peace and security. Sorry, end of lecture.
The tiny techie point, I worked 15 years in Switzerland. Switzerland does accept de facto free movement. In fact, 27% of the Swiss population was born in the EU, much higher percentage than any other country, and they don't get hysterical about it. That is partly because, I mean, there are techie problems to do with the role of the European Court of Justice, that they are very devolved confederations. We know the cantons, which are about the size of big towns, cities in Scotland or England, set their own income tax, have their own regulations. There's permanent social partnership. The workers in Switzerland, the employees, have a sense that if the companies are bringing in European workers, it's for everybody to benefit from it. And we don't have trade unions ready to do that. I mean, we've just seen, we've had all our strikes here in Britain or in the UK, sorry, in England, and we suddenly discovered we've got 4 or 5 railway unions. We've got 4 or 5 healthcare unions. That doesn't exist in Germany or Switzerland. There's one transport workers union, one healthcare union. They have works councils, which the TUC's always refused. They then determine hiring, their identity cards, so people know who's in the country. This is all a discussion. I mean, I'm not talking about policy. I'm not expecting Paul Keir to make speeches on this, but I wish we'd some Labour MPs who were saying, if we're to get anywhere a bit closer to Europe, these are some of the questions we should address. Why are there no trade unions? Just don't even discuss Europe at the moment at all. I mean, that's half of our labour movement. I just put these points to Labour friends in particular. We have a very, I read the New Statesman Guide like everybody. There's just no serious discussion about the post-Brexit Britain, if I may call that in to satisfy dear Diana, that on what might happen.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. On your point about discussion, perhaps this is a suitable peg on which I can bring this particular meeting to a close. Now, I know there's still some questions and comments in the chat which perhaps haven't been answered directly, but I think all the ones which can be answered have been answered. I think there's other comments which are contributions to debate, which is fine, but I don't think will probably be ones which would be really ones which are really directed more at Ian, I suspect, because they're more to do with politics within Scotland, and I think Ian would obviously be the person who we probably want to focus those on. But on the question of discussion, one of the things that we try and do with the European movement in Scotland, and indeed the European movement in the UK as well, is to precisely have that discussion. We have a wide range of webinars on all sorts of subjects to do with the politics of the different political parties, how they approach Europe and Brexit, or whatever you want to call it. But also, we look at the political developments elsewhere in Europe, what happens in different countries after elections. We looked at one in a seminar, webinar on what Ukraine means for European policy widely, a whole number of issues which we do, as well as have campaigning for European issues. So that is why, if you found this webinar interesting, if you support what we're doing in the European movement of Scotland, please think about joining us. So we are a membership-run organisation, very limited staff resources. We need members, we need funds, so please do think about joining us. If you are from elsewhere in the UK, European Movement UK obviously operates throughout the UK or in association with us in Scotland, and there may be some of you who are from outside of the UK. The European movement has groups and organisations within almost every European country, inside and outside of the European Union. So please think about joining us. And at the end of this webinar, a slide will come up with the contact details for European movement in Scotland. So please think about joining us and think about supporting us. But Dennis, please come in with
only to friend. You know, the quality of questions has been very, very good, and I'm sorry if I've used the wrong phrase here or there. I mean, I speak many European languages, but my mother claims she cradled with me and my younger brother in her arms when I was 1 and he was 6 months, and she heard our first vowel sounds because we moved to London, or my father did, to find work, and she heard our first vowel sounds and she said, "But what have you English ever done for Scotland?" So I've had to live with that problem all my life. But one thing I keep asking for, suggesting, could we do Brexit in one town? Put some resources in, if there are any keys or people, just the impact in a smallish town, not a giant city like Aberdeen or Edinburgh or Glasgow, and just all the different ways that all the firms have been impacted, the schools have been impacted, maybe there's a university's been impacted, the medical services who can't get the European workers and dentists and doctors and so on, and just list Brexit in one town. I think we could try and bring it down to people in their communities. It's no use writing op-eds in the Guardian or the Herald or whatever. Just to bring it down to a local community, quite a small level, of all the different ways Brexit, your holidays, your passports for pets, I know, buying a retirement home, 101 ways, call it what you will, the isolation from Europe has made life worse for all of us. And do not underestimate, please, Britain is in decline. There isn't a single index in which we're not going slightly south. It's happening inevitably, inexorably. And a country in decline, its politics become very unpleasant, difficult, which we can see with Suella Braverman and the boats issue and so on. And it's much wider just than trade. It's about whether Britain's going to become like the Habsburgs or the Ottomans, a great past, a great history, great literature, and all the rest of it, but steadily getting to be a weaker and weaker United Kingdom.
Dennis, thank you, Dennis. But Dianne, do you want to come in with a last word, or you want to leave it at that?
What a way to end. No, I realised the one question that was in either the chat or the Q&A was, will Labour promise to appeal the one we're dealing with in the laws at the moment, the retained European law? European Union law. Actually, there would be no point repealing it if it goes through. Then New Year's Eve tonight, this year rather, New Year's Eve this year, all those laws fall out. So it wouldn't be a matter of repealing that act because it would have happened, unless there's a sunset clause that goes, beyond the election, which I'm not sure we can win in the Commons. I think the important thing is to work with standard setters, because we'll have to have our own standard setters and try and get any new standards, whether it is over the chemicals that Ian's mentioned or about consumer rights, all of that, as aligned as possible to make it much easier then for that growing closer relationship once we get back.
Okay, thank you, Dianne. That was a question which I had left out, so thank you for highlighting that. Well, thank you again, Dennis and Dianne, and it was Ian in his absence. Thank you to all of you who have joined us tonight and contributed to debate in various ways. And once again, please think about joining and supporting the European movement. We need your support, and we hope you will join us at a future webinar and at a future campaign in the street as well. We do that as well, towns and cities up and down the country as well, making precise the kind of points, Dennis, which you've urged us to do. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
For anyone who's still watching, who is wanting details of European movement in Scotland, for some reason, the slide which gave these details isn't appearing, but if you search on the web for European movement in Scotland, you can find us very easily, and we're on Twitter and Instagram as well. So please do think about joining us and follow us in that way as well. Thank you very much indeed. Good night, everyone.